Yeah, today I'm excited to talk about some new research we have out at Energy Innovation that my colleague Eric Gimon and I undertook based on a coal plant in Pueblo, Colorado, and what the options are to replace it with flexible, clean industry, as well as sustainable energy in the form of something we're referring to as an energy park. So, first of all, what is an energy park? An energy park combines generation and load. And essentially, the way that we've imagined it here is to be a combination of renewable energy that would generate power, storage that helps balance out the generated renewable energy, as well as something we're referring to as flexible loads or flexible users of electricity, particularly industrial users of electricity that can use electricity primarily during times of high renewable generation and ramp down their use during times of low renewable generation. And it turns out that this combination of resources can really be a win-win situation because first, the renewable energy provides really cheap power to these industrial customers, so they get access to cheap power. And the flexible industry can balance out that renewable energy generation while stimulating new economic activity. And the second question is, why Pueblo? So we focused this research on Pueblo because Pueblo contains the site of the Comanche Unit 3 coal-fired generating unit, which is scheduled to be retired in 2031. This is significant for multiple reasons. First of all, of course, the coal plant has been polluting. Coal is a very pollution-heavy type of electric generator, so it's been polluting the community around Pueblo for decades. But at the same time, the community has depended on the jobs and tax revenue that the plant has been providing. So, in order to think about what could replace the plant, we need to think about what can replace the jobs and tax revenue from the plant. In addition to the energy that the plant provides, which is really, kind of the focus of how the utility is thinking about replacing the plant. So in addition to those factors, Pueblo is also well connected to existing grid infrastructure and has an existing industrial customer base that can start to serve potentially some of those flexible load roles. And in addition to that, Pueblo also has strong renewable energy resources, particularly solar resources, and can be kind of a gateway to stronger wind resources in Southeast Colorado. When we looked at this type of aggregate resource for Pueblo, for this energy park for Pueblo, we saw a lot of benefits. First of all, the jobs and tax revenue from this energy park and the new industrial customers associated with it can exceed those provided by the original Comanche power plant. We estimate that you could generate over 300 high-quality permanent jobs and up to $40 million in annual tax revenue. Importantly, a lot of the energy generated by the park stays in the community, which is something that doesn't happen right now with the existing power plant, and really drives economic activity in the community. It's also an incremental approach that can be built over time, reducing the risk of materialization on any single type of technology. And it also has potential to diversify the economy because you're adding, a combination of different resources, not just one thing that's going to, again, retire in 30 years and create a new jobs and tax revenue cliff. The energy park could also operate flexibly and help balance the other resources that Xcel plans to add to the grid. And it would provide cheap electricity to electricity customers because the industrial customers are paying for that electricity too. So before I go into some of the modeling details, I just wanted to take a step back and explain, some examples of what we mean by flexible industry. There are a couple different types of technologies, flexible industrial technologies that we modeled in our analysis, one being something called a thermal battery, which can provide heat to a high temperature heat customer, of which there are already several in Pueblo, such as the steel mill, such as the cement plant, things like that. And what this thermal battery does is it takes in electricity, again, at times when there's a lot of electricity available, converts it to heat, which it stores in this heat storage medium in a box, and then can output a steady stream of heat for an industrial customer. So even though it can take in electricity flexibly, it can output heat in a steady way that those high temperature customers really need. So this is something that is kind of already in stages of production today. Many thermal battery startups are moving beyond the pilot phase, installing at kind of commercial and utility scale phase. The second type of flexible industry that we model in our report is something called a hydrogen electrolyzer, which takes in electricity and uses it to split a water molecule into hydrogen and oxygen. And it's that hydrogen molecule that can then be used for a variety of different things. Some things that hydrogen can be used for include ammonia for fertilizer or something like sustainable aviation fuel. But it's something that can happen really flexibly, and there's a lot of interest around right now due to some recently passed federal tax credits and an additional tax credit for the generation of clean hydrogen in Colorado. So there are a few different companies that are working to produce green hydrogen right now via flexible electricity, such as Thales Renewables, which is building green ammonia facilities across the Midwest, and Intersect Powered, which plans to make green hydrogen for e-fuels in Texas, powered by solar and wind. So how do all these pieces come together in Pueblo? I'll go first through kind of like the role that each part of the energy park would play. The first role is for wind and solar, this first component, which would essentially be the energy provider to the grid and flexible industry. The second component is short duration storage in the form of 4-hour battery storage, which smooths out hourly and daily variation in wind and solar output. The third component are these flexible industries that I've been talking about, which can use power during high renewable output and reduce usage during high net demand. We consider both electrolyzers and thermal batteries here. And then the fourth component is a long duration storage component, which can actually take the flexible industries and what they've created out of electricity, such as heat, and convert it back into electricity at times when wind and solar output are really low or demand is really high and the regular batteries aren't able to provide enough back to the grid. So this long duration storage, and the way that we've imagined it in our analysis, is essentially thermal batteries, which would be located on site at potentially the Comanche coal plant site, and either reuse some of the existing turbines there, or you could build a new turbine. But essentially, once you have that heat stored, you could use that heat to then create steam that could turn a turbine in a similar way to the coal plant operates right now, but without burning coal. So those are the four components of the energy park and how they work together. How they might be positioned around Pueblo. There's a variety of interesting sites in Pueblo that could host components of this energy park, including the Comanche site itself, which would kind of serve as a locus for all of these resources to potentially connect to the grid through. Again, you would maybe have some of your long duration storage components located at the Comanche plant site and some of your 4-hour batteries. Your solar and wind would be located at various sites around the county and potentially in further southeast Colorado. We see a lot of potential for new industry to be sited at the Puebloplex site, as well as heat batteries, these thermal batteries that would be sited actually at the existing industrial customer sites and potential new industrial customer sites. So that's kind of how things might look in Pueblo, just an overview of how that could look. So now we'll get into our modeling a little bit. I'm just going to kind of touch at this at a high level before jumping into our key findings. But so what we modeled here is, for that first component, we modeled 2,000 megawatts of solar and 1,600 megawatts of wind, 500 megawatts of 4-hour batteries. For our flexible industries, we modeled 10 thermal batteries that could provide 200 megawatts of heat to high temperature heat customers, and 400 megawatts of electrolyzers. On the long duration storage front, we modeled another 20 thermal batteries that would again be located likely on site at the Comanche plant that can reconvert heat back to electricity, up to 160 megawatts of electricity. So that's what we modeled. And essentially what we did was we compared an optimized version of the dispatch of these resources, or how all these resources can work together, to a version of Comanche Unit 3's behavior in 2023. Unfortunately, Comanche Unit 3, as many of you may know, has not been a particularly reliable power plant over the last several years. And in 2023, it had about 8 periods of likely unplanned outages. So in this histogram here, it's essentially showing how often Comanche 3 was operating at its various, up to its max output. So most of the time, the plant is operating between 60 and 100% of its maximum output. But then about 10% of the time, there was what seems to be an unplanned outage in the power plant. So in order to kind of optimize our energy park, we corrected the behavior of this power plant and compared it to a version of the power plant that didn't have these unplanned outages. So what does this look like? When we just had wind and solar, when we just looked at what wind and solar could generate compared to the coal plant, we saw that in this kind of yellowish color here is that target output for what Comanche Unit 3's behavior looked like in 2023 if it didn't have those unplanned outages. And then the blue bars represent what wind and solar can generate on their own. And so what we see is that a lot of times wind and solar is producing above the output of the coal plant, but there are a few times throughout the year where they're producing a little bit less. So this is why we need to add the batteries and the flexible industries, because as you can see, a lot of the time there's a lot of extra energy on the system. So those flexible industries and batteries can soak up that extra energy and even transfer some of it to these times when the wind and solar is a little bit lower compared to that target output for Comanche. So that's kind of the goal here is with the flexible industries is to be able to utilize a lot of this extra energy and shift some of it to the times of lower wind and solar output to create an aggregate resource that can match this target profile really well. So once we did all of this optimization, optimizing our wind and solar, batteries, flexible industries, and long duration storage to match our idealized version of the Comanche output, we had 3 key findings. First, we found that the energy park can be a highly reliable grid resource and produce energy for the local economy. We found that the energy park can generate high quality permanent jobs and tax revenue. And we also found that the energy park would be much cheaper for Colorado electricity customers than a comparable clean firm resource. So I'll jump into those now. So on our first key finding on reliability and energy for Pueblo, we found that the energy park, the aggregation of resources that we modeled could actually deliver energy to the grid more reliably than the existing Comanche power plant. I mentioned that the plant had about 10% of the time was not operating when it seemed like it should have been operating. So yeah, the Comanche power plant itself was only about 90% reliable compared to the idealized target that we created. Whereas the energy park we found could be 99% reliable. So a significant boost in reliability compared to even the existing Comanche plant. And what we see on these 2 graphs here is that without long duration storage, you're generating about 9.8 million megawatt hours of energy. 3.2 million of that are delivered to the grid, kind of to match that profile of Comanche. You also have a lot of energy delivered to your industrial customers, as well as a little bit of extra. When we add long duration storage, what we see is that we have more grid delivered energy. We're able to match that profile almost perfectly. So we have 3.4 million megawatt hours delivered to the grid, which is, again, matching that profile 99% of the time. We have a significant portion of the energy delivered to those industrial customers in Pueblo. About 40% of the energy stays in Pueblo to power new industry and power the economy in Pueblo. And we don't really have, too much more in the way of energy lost in the round trip efficiency of long duration storage, because a lot of it is coming from energy that would have been curtailed or just not used anyways. So that's the reliability. On the tax revenue and jobs, we found by creating kind of an example deployment schedule for how these resources could deploy. This is really just one example. It could happen in any number of ways, but imagining that some of the wind and solar resources would be deployed earliest, and then the industrial customers would kind of come online later in the early 2030s. What we saw is that the tax revenue peaks at around over 40 million annually. And the bulk of the tax revenue is actually coming from those flexible industrial customers, like the electrolyzers, like the thermal batteries that are sited at high temperature heat facilities. So that really just goes to show that the economic engine of the energy park is really the flexible industry and not necessarily the energy production itself, which is quite good news for Pueblo because it means that the economy won't necessarily be depending on this one single resource to provide so much tax revenue in the future. It will be a much more diversified tax revenue base. On jobs, we found that the energy park could create over 350 permanent jobs. And again, a lot of these jobs are coming from the flexible industries, not necessarily the energy generation resources, although they do come from that as well. And like I mentioned, these are permanent jobs, not construction jobs, so they will be there over the course of the life of these facilities. And particularly from the hydrogen electrolyzer facilities, these are, essentially chemical plants. So they have the types of high quality jobs that folks in Pueblo could really depend on. So these include things like engineers, plant operators, business operators. And something that's quite exciting about this is that the energy park would start creating jobs even before Comanche retires. So, you're not going to have a 10-year gap between Comanche retiring and a new facility coming online to create jobs. You could also even potentially retain jobs from the existing site. I talked about how you could site thermal batteries at the Comanche site, use them to kind of produce electricity through the existing turbines. So some of those plant operation jobs at the site could remain as well. And then our third finding is on the costs of the energy park. So what we found is that the energy park would be cheaper than some other options that have been proposed for regenerating the property tax and energy from the Comanche plant. So in particular, compared to a small modular nuclear reactor, we find that the cost would be quite a bit reduced and even more significantly for electricity customers. So with a small modular reactor, we estimated that it could cost up to or even over $11 billion for about a 500 megawatt nuclear reactor based on some similar projects that have been attempted at various locations in the US. Maybe around 40% of that would be covered by the investment tax credit, but that means that $7 billion would fall to electricity customers to pay for. And this includes the capital cost of the plant, the operation maintenance, and the fuel as well. For the energy park, conversely, not only is the overall cost much less than something like a small modular nuclear reactor, but the electricity customers pay a smaller share. The existing kind of residential electricity customers would pay a smaller share because the industrial customers, the flexible electrolyzers and the heat customers are also paying for that electricity and therefore the infrastructure itself. So we essentially find that the average Colorado electricity customer would pay less than half than what they would for something like a small modular nuclear reactor. So just a few conclusions for you all, and then I will take some questions. First of all, we find that the energy park pathway offers a compelling way to develop a very reliable, clean, firm 500 megawatt project, while also stimulating local economic development by providing cheap electricity and heat. We find significant jobs and tax revenue would be created due to new industrial activity. The overall costs of the project would be significantly cheaper overall and to Colorado's electricity customers. And finally, this flexible approach has a big potential for economic diversification. The project evolves in multiple steps, avoiding commitment to a single untested technology or future economic dependence on a single facility. So thanks so much for listening, and thanks so much to Eric Gimon for really spearheading the modeling on this project and lots of people who gave us really helpful feedback throughout. I will stop sharing my screen now and take some questions. Okay. So the first question, does the energy park concept work with a large centralized generating source like a nuclear power plant or a gas plant? This concept isn't really compatible with the idea of a single large generator because you would be building it up step by step over time in smaller bits and pieces. So Yeah, overall, the types of things that are going to be most compatible with this are, clean energy, fall into the buckets that I've talked about, which are clean energy in the form of wind and solar, batteries, thermal batteries, other flexible industries, and things like that. Are all of the various parts of the energy park commercially available now? So all of the various parts of the energy park are in various stages of commercial development, I would say. There are currently green hydrogen facilities under construction, and thermal battery facilities kind of starting out as well. And then the bigger parts, or the initial parts of the wind, solar, and short duration batteries, those are all very widely commercially available and could be starting to deploy today, while those others are kind of in various stages of development, but at quite high levels of technology readiness. Okay, next question. You described the park as being able to be developed in multiple phases. Could development on the energy park begin even before the Comanche plant closes? Yes, development could definitely begin even before the Comanche plant closes, because as I said, a lot of these technologies are already being deployed today. So you could certainly start the wind, solar, and battery aspects right away. And then since we have a lot of hydrogen electrolyzer and thermal battery projects kind of in the beginning phases, those could also likely start in really the early 2030s, and you could have pilot projects happening even before then. So with the timeline of 2031 for the plant closure, a lot of this could start happening before 2031. Okay. What kind of industries would be good fits for co-locating at the Comanche site to take advantage of the storage capacity? So I talked about this a little bit in the presentation. Really any type of industry that needs to use heat for whatever process they're undergoing could be a good fit for co-locating with this Comanche site. Thermal batteries can provide heat up to, I think right now they're at about 1700 degrees Celsius. So that is good for quite a lot of industrial processes. And they could really kind of be drop-in replacements for anything that a boiler is doing at an industrial facility. So I mentioned potentially the steel plant. It looks like there's maybe an airplane brake plant in Pueblo that could also is utilizing heat at around these temperatures as well. So really anything like that. And then I talked as well about the potential for hydrogen electrolyzers here. And those are a really good fit just because they're really, really flexible in their operation. Let's see. One of the criticisms of renewables like wind and solar is that they're not available 24/7. The energy park proposal would seem to be a bridge that helps turn renewables into more of a baseload power source. Can you provide some more detail on that? Yeah, so essentially, because as we all know, wind and solar are weather-dependent resources. They produce energy primarily when the wind is blowing and when the sun is shining. That means that in order to take most advantage of all of the energy they're producing, you need to be able to balance them out with something. You can do a lot of that with regular battery storage that can simply store electricity and output electricity at a later time. But you're not really getting the biggest benefit out of that, and you're not able to kind of balance all of the variation in wind and solar. So that's where the flexible industries really come in here, because they have huge potential to both soak up power and use it for something else, as well as dial back at times of low renewable output, or even give energy back to the grid at those times of renewable output. So it's really the flexible industries that do the really big balancing work here and help you get the most out of the power that you're generating. Okay, so let's see. What kind of incentives are there for Xcel to pursue an energy park? Solely from a financial/profit perspective, wouldn't it be better for the company to get approval for a big multi-billion-dollar project rather than a flexible and modular facility? That might be true. I mean, utilities, and Xcel is an investor-owned utility, so they generally make a profit. based on kind of the investment that they put into something. But typically those projects, they do need to be approved by a regulator. So generally the regulator is looking for the project that will be most cost effective for the customers. So it's really important also to balance out those cost considerations for the customers. And as I mentioned, the energy park has some big cost benefits for customers. There are also some other kind of state requirements around Xcel, and in particular, there's a new clean heat standard in Colorado that is a really kind of cool policy that Colorado has enacted that would require slowly the decarbonization of heat over time. And since Xcel also provides heat, not just electricity, I think that this proposal has some really interesting kind of synergies for Xcel to help meet that clean heat standard as well as the clean electricity standards that they are already shooting for and making quite a lot of progress on. So yeah, I guess I'll take this last question as well. Are there energy parks up and operating anywhere in the US and in the world? So this is kind of an interesting question. This concept of co-locating generation and load isn't necessarily something that's entirely new. We see kind of similar concepts with combined heat and power plants that both generate electricity and use some of that waste heat for industrial processes today. So that aspect of like co-locating these two things together is not new. I don't know that there's a project that necessarily combines every single one of these components together yet, although there are projects that combine, maybe one or two of these components. Like I talked about this Intersect Power in Texas that's combining wind and solar and electrolyzers. There's a project in Oregon that combines wind, solar, and batteries that can orchestrate all together and provide steady output power to the grid. So this concept, any energy park that you were to create in it, wherever it were to be, would probably look a little bit different depending on the region, but there's definitely a lot of models for how this could look like. And I think it's an amazing opportunity for Pueblo and Colorado in general, which has already been such a leader in the clean energy transition, to really try to kind of pioneer this synergistic concept between electricity and industry, especially when we're trying to decarbonize both electricity and heat. So yeah, that looks like it's it for the questions. So I will leave it here, and thanks for tuning in, and yeah, happy to answer any other questions. And thanks so much, everyone.